Welcome to the GC9X Post Mortem. I'm Kal.
And this is Snarboo. Today we're looking at Tenka, a PlayStation FPS from 1997. Now, this game actually has a couple of different titles, doesn't it? Depending on what
Yes.
region it's from.
I guess technically it's called Lifeforce Tenka, which is the European, but when it was released in the US, for no really apparent reason, they changed it to Codename Tenka. It's Lifeforce Tenka or it's Codename Tenka, and you might know it as one or the other.
And for the sake of for this post-mortem, we're just probably going to refer to it as Tenka.
Well, Tenka is both the name of the game and the name of its lead character, but Lifeforce Tenka is a bit heavy, so whatever.
So what exactly is Tenka, and why should we care about this game exactly?
Well, it's an early 3D first-person shooter for Sony's PlayStation 1. Other than Jumping Flash, there isn't really a true 3D first-person shooter before Tenka on the PlayStation. You had a couple of other games like Disruptor, you had a port of Doom. I think it actually came out before the port of Duke Nukem 3D. Basically, you can move in full 3D, the environments are all rendered with polygons, and so are the enemies and objects. It's got some pretty good graphics. For 97, it looks fairly good on the PlayStation. And it also has a bunch of little features that you don't necessarily see before it, but are really common today.
Actually, that brings up a good question. Is this actually the first 3D FPS on any console? Because I can't remember if Turok came out in 97. Did it?
Ooh, I know it came out before GoldenEye, but
Yeah, the first Turok was definitely before GoldenEye. I'm actually curious now because this game's actually pretty advanced for its time in a number of ways. Okay, it's
Turok is 1997 February.
So yeah,
Turok beats out it for full 3D.
Yeah, it's fully 3D. This would be the first fully 3D FPS on a console. I mean, unless anyone can name another game, otherwise I'm going to consider this the first fully 3D FPS on any console.
Yeah, I can't think of any, but as I said, Jumping Flash came out before. Jumping Flash was a launch title in 95. It's a fully rendered 3D game. There's no 2D objects in it, as far as I remember, except maybe trees or something. But Jumping Flash is kind of an oddball. It's not.
It's a platformer. It's just it's kind of an odd mix of genres because it's got like the combat of an FPS game where that's the main form of combat, but it's mostly a platformer. Like I think you can even jump on enemies.
Yeah, you can jump on enemies, but I don't know if that disqualifies it from being a first-person shooter style game. You can jump on enemies, but you do shoot them. And you do get secondary weapons. I don't know. It doesn't diminish the achievements of Turok or Tenka.
So Tenka was developed by Psygonsis, which was a pretty famous Amiga developer.
Probably, well, at the time they were one of the most famous British dev houses. They'd been around since the Amiga days and made a lot of very pretty but fairly incomprehensible or frustrating games. They're probably most famous for Shadow of the Beast. But they also did, was it Terra Firma? Not Terra something.
I just don't remember.
They had a lot of Roger Dean art, and you'd recognize about all of their boxes. They also did something like the Killing Game show, called Rewind or something.
Fatal Rewind, yeah, in the
Fatal
United States. I always like that name given... Well, actually, it should be Fatal Fast Forward, because the way the mechanic works is, like, if you die, you can just have the game autoplay itself up to wherever you died, which is kind of a weird feature. So if you don't want to do a lot of the tedious backtracking, once you restart the level, you can just have the game handle it up to a point and then take control at any time. But otherwise, yeah, it's kind of pointless.
Yeah, so, and then 93, 94, they were actually bought by Sony. And Sony relied on them heavily to produce a suite of different games for the PlayStation console. So they developed a bunch of PlayStation titles. In fact, some of the most famous PlayStation games were developed by Psygnosis. You had Wipeout, Colony Wars. I think they published Roll Cage. I think a different development team actually made Roll Cage. They also did G-Police. There's a couple more in there. I think Overboard, that was one of theirs. They also did ODT. Just a really big list of games. But they also made some serious garbage.
Whether or not you include Shadow of the Beast in that list is up for debate.
What isn't up for debate is they made Rascals and Cyberdeck, and those are two of the worst games on the PlayStation. Tenka kind of is awkward in that regard because it's a good game, but it's not. It's got a lot of failings to it.
Actually, I think we should mention before Tenka, Psygonsis actually did dabble with with another 3D game in the form of Ecstatica, although it's not true 3D. There's some trickery going on because everything's made of, well, balls.
There's nothing
In the literal sense, like they're spheres.
And Psygonsis was just a publisher on that one, though. That
Oh,
was,
they didn't develop it? Okay.
Well, that was Andrew Spence's studio.
Oh, okay.
He disappeared.
No one knows what happened to him.
I don't. He's gone.
He went back to his home planet after a game with balls. And only, you know, it would make sense if he was an alien. That's just such a bizarre concept for a game.
It would be perfect if he was like, he came in, it's like, okay, I'm gonna lead you into the future, mankind, and the future is ellipsoids. We hate ellipsoids. Fuck it, I'm out. But yeah, so that's Psygnosis. They were eventually turned into basically a Wipeout Formula 1 factory, and Sony closed them in somewhere in the 2000s, I think mid to late 2000s. They closed up shop, and that was the end of Psygnosis entirely. Though their name was changed in 1999, I think.
To Sony Liverpool or something, wasn't it?
Yeah, something really generic.
SCE Studio Liverpool. Okay, so they closed in actually 2012.
Man, that's much sooner. I'm surprised, but I guess they only made Wipeout and Formula 1 games for like the last 12 years of their existence.
Yeah, pretty much. Which, you know, there are a lot of way, way worse ways to go out.
Yeah, well, I mean, a couple of their late Wipeout games were pretty good. It's kind of just sad, because they basically definitely wanted to make more games than just that, but Sony wasn't going to have it. Anyway, back to Tenka. So, can you actually play the game, or is it just too dated at this point?
Well, obviously it's pretty dated for, you know, given it's a console FPS released in the year 1997, but it's actually surprisingly playable. Like, the control scheme's actually pretty cleverly thought out. You look up and down with L1 and R1, you can strafe with R2, and then you can select items or activate switches by using R1. Okay, I think you strafe with R2, and then, yeah, the inventory is R1. Anyway, fire is actually mapped to X, which is the primary game button, which, you know, makes sense. You use that to navigate menus and the like. I think running is on... yes, running is square, circle is crouch, which is toggle crouch, which is very handy, and then triangle is jump.
Triangle's jump. It's a triangle jump game, so it joins the pedigree of games like Devil May Cry in putting triangle as jump. But
it makes sense because the triangle looks like an up arrow, so...
It makes a lot... It's a tough one to get your head around, because in a game where you don't do much jumping, triangle makes perfect sense. It's the top of the controller, it's up, you go up when you press it. I have no problem with it. You don't really need to jump in Tenka almost ever. I'm trying to think of when you need it.
There's no real platforming sequences, at least from what I saw. I didn't actually beat the game, I should note.
Neither of us got all the way to the end, but it's, as far as I remember, I think you can jump occasionally. You can use it to quickly move across the conveyor belts, because, you know, you aren't affected by them in the air. There's not very many platforming puzzles, so it feels kind of... Oh, you can jump on top of, like, there's scenery that you can jump on top of sometimes.
Oh yeah, there's probably a few instances of that.
Like, you could do that. I mean, I think you can jump up there and fight the melee enemies much easier if the stars align and that situation presents itself.
But it actually plays pretty solid. Something that's really curious about this game, though, is that while you can look up and down, there's an auto lock-on system. Like, if you hover your, like, cursor over the enemy, actually, I don't think you start off with a crosshair. I think you actually have to unlock it, which is something I can get to in a bit. But yeah, if you aim in the general direction of an enemy, like, your cursor will lock on, and then all of your shots should hit the enemy. And it's kind of weird in a way, because you still have to look up or down to hit enemies on the floor, and it doesn't always target the enemy you want it to hit. Like, I think if an enemy's right on top of you, it will not target it at all. They have to be a certain distance away.
It's not horrible. The problem with it specifically is it's a mandatory auto aim. You can't switch it off. Even if you want to get tricky with your aiming, you can't. If you look at an enemy, and sometimes you can shoot through walls using it, It depends. If you can get an enemy in your sights and you can keep them locked on, you'll be able to hit them even if you're physically shooting through a wall. I don't think it works that way for the rockets, though. If you're using a rocket launcher and you try that, you'll just kill yourself.
Which makes sense, you know, the fine FPS tradition of a weapon in your arsenal that does more damage to you than the enemy.
And boy, does Tenka have those.
Yeah, the level design for the era is pretty decent. I mean, the game still looks good. Like, it's got really nice colored lighting, which is really surprising for a console FPS from the era. They kind of sacrificed level design in favor of like better visuals. Like the models and the textures are actually comparable to like something like Quake 2, but the levels are like highly condensed. Like there's a lot of narrow corridors and like really cramped areas.
But yeah. Corridors. There's like a couple of open rooms which are generally very small open rooms, or they're kind of open but they're very flat, just like cubes or something. Just you can see a little further. As far as I remember, there's no outdoor bits. There's just you go from one corridor environment to another, and I got a little bit of burnout from the game because despite the impressive visuals, there just don't feel like there's enough variety in what you're presented with, because you go from an apartment complex, which is okay, but then you go to like a sort of a warehousey industrial complex, and then you go to an industrial sort of scientific complex, and then you go to another sort of very similar complex. You get to go to a map with ice on it, but then the game just sends you backwards through all the levels you just played with new enemies. Yeah.
Oh, so
yeah,
it's one of those games, I see. See, I didn't actually get that far. I got up to like a set of levels. And this is kind of the odd thing, like the game actually gives you sets of levels in like pairs of two. So like the first theme is like the apartment complex and like an urban sort of thing. Second level is, as you know, like a warehouse. And then there's an industrial complex, then a laboratory, and then I think the prison comes right after, and that's as far as I was able to get up to. Because if there's one thing that does kind of date this game, I don't even know if it necessarily dates it, it's just a bad design decision, is that the game is like weirdly difficult. Like it starts off pretty decently, but then as you get further in, it becomes this odd game of attrition, and you can kind of tell that they had a path in mind for you to go through the levels. And if you don't go through it that way, like you just die. Like you run out of ammo, you run out of shields, the enemies just like swarm you. It's weird.
There's no difficulty settings, which isn't hugely surprising. And yeah, you get in the early levels, it's kind of confusing because you struggle more with ammo early on. Because the tanker gun, and I guess we can talk about the tanker gun, it has about 4 or 5 different functions. There's a ballistic function, a laser function, a rocket function, a grenade function, and a mine function. Now, several of the functions have multiple modes. You've got your gun that shoots single fire, burst fire, and auto fire, or rapid fire, I guess. And then you got laser, which is single laser and double laser. And you got rocket and grenade and mine. And they all draw from different ammo pools, except for the modes that share the same ballistic type. So when you start the game, you only really have bullets, and this means that the game doesn't throw very many bullets at you. So until you sort of unlock the better weapons, you're really going to struggle.
And the first weapon you unlock, too, or the second weapon you unlock after the double fire, is the mine, which is probably the most gloriously useless thing I have seen in one of these sort of games.
The thing about the mine is, I could see it being useful in so many other first-person shooters. It's a weapon that would be great in a different game. Thing is, Tanker's entire enemy set is either small, fast-moving melee enemies, or ranged enemies who never try to get close to you. They're more than happy to sit at mid to long range and take potshots at you.
Also, the mines don't work on flying enemies, I don't think, either, and like a lot of the enemies in the game fly, so...
Especially when you get the mines. When you get the mines, you go through like 2 or 3 stages where the majority of enemies are in the air or are turrets. Which is great, because the best thing to do with the mines is to put them on the ground and kill yourself, because that's the only thing you're going to manage to do with them. Plus, I don't think enemies can cross the thresholds of rooms all the time. I think it's one of those games where they have a limited degree of where they can go. So you can't even lure an enemy into the mine by running away. It's just not a great weapon. and there's a weapon in there that's super overpowered. You didn't unlock it, Snarboo, but the double laser is crazy. It instantly kills just about anything in like half a second. And it doesn't use very much ammunition to do that either. It basically completely invalidates the entire weapon set. At least when you initially get it, it makes everything else useless. And it does kind of feel like they might have gone a little sloppy towards the end. And you do actually get a second set of levels, or at least you get to play a few more. Because once you've gone backwards through all the levels you played, you then go to sewers. And that's actually when I left off, because I wasn't prepared to go through a sewer level. Tenka's an okay game, but sewer levels are not known for being very good. And it didn't seem like it was going to be a very good level.
So essentially the game is in fact playable. Like I enjoyed it, at least as far as I was able to get before it just gets kind of weird. And
I guess we should just quickly play it. It's playable. The game's generous and also not. It's a very, very strict game, but you don't have a limit on your continues, which initially surprised me, because for whatever reason, oodles of PlayStation 1 games, especially early games, they had this thing where they carried over like continues and lives, even on your save files, so that you would have a limited amount of lives. And if you ran out of lives, even if you had saves, you would have to reload from when you last had a life or two. That would be the only place that you could reload. I know Crash Bandicoot does this, and it's horribly frustrating. Where it's like, it doesn't matter where you go, you have to get a save point, and then you have to have lives, otherwise, you lose a couple lives, it's game over. Tenka, you die, the game just starts you at the beginning of the stage with full health, full shield, and full half ammunition. It's like a standard amount that you usually start with. Downside, the stages are like 20 to 30 minutes long.
Now, are you counting the fact that they're actually split into two parts? Because I'm wondering how they count the levels, because there's supposed to be 20 levels in this game, and I've probably played through 10 so far.
I think they do count those as individual levels. So I think there's about 15 or 16 levels on the cycle to get down to the bottom level and get then all the way back up, and then I think there's a few more after that. I haven't finished it, but I don't know if my opinion would change, because, that's as far as we can get. The enemy set's great. Really surprised how many enemies there are in the game. You start off fighting mutants, and then you fight robots, which, fly around, and there's turrets. Then you also fight the severed head from The Thing, the John Carpenter film. Fight that. It's just literally that head just copy-pasted into Tenka, complete with, like, spider limbs, and it just runs at you and tries to fight you or something. Additionally, there's an enemy that's like him, and he's kind of this weird pudgy monster, very short, but you can shoot his legs off. And he has two legs, and if you shoot both his legs off, he just sits there staring at you as a severed head, incapable of attacking you, which was a really nice touch. You also fight some cool gold robots, which I know, Snarboo, you wouldn't have gotten up to those, but yeah. They were a lot of fun. They have acrobatic moves. They like sort of flip forward and flip backwards, and they shoot like sort of semi-slow moving blasts at you, and if they get close, they do like an AoE attack. They were a lot of fun to fight, and it was a real shame that they basically put these robots in. Like, there's no real balance curve to the game. The first level's pretty easy, but after that, it's a real grab bag, on whether it's going to be an easy stage or a hard stage. Plus, there's mine levels, where you have to defuse bombs, and they're absolutely terrible stages.
Mine defusal. I'm glad I didn't get to that.
Oh, it's so bad. Like, you got a time limit to defuse all of the bombs, but every time you pick up a bomb, the bomb itself has a time limit that activates when you pick it up, and you have to take it to the bomb disposal unit within the time limit, or else the bomb explodes and you take like a humongous amount of damage. And since there's enemies in the stage, what this equates to is you have to basically clear the entire stage of enemies and then rush every single bomb one at a time to the bomb disposal unit. If you screw up more than like one of them, you'll die. And you have to do the whole stage again, and you have to clear it all over again. That was tedious. So tedious, and it throws like 6 of these stages at you.
Oh lord.
Wasn't the most fun. Thankfully, the game has a cheat to skip levels. If you didn't like a level, you can cheat past it. No problem. Super easy. Curious element of the game's design. Because of the way it works, the game only has about 2 or 3 different enemy types per level. I figure this is just a PlayStation restriction that they couldn't.
It's probably a memory limitation because they have to load up the enemies and the textures for that enemy.
And it's a real shame because it means that basically the levels sort of have themed enemies, but there's this one enemy who basically fires machine guns at you, and then he fires double rockets or single rockets, but he fires them with no discernible pattern, and they sort of track you through walls. If you can dodge them by hiding behind the wall, but if you're standing in front of the rocket, it'll sort of wobble towards you. And yeah, those are really frustrating enemies to deal with because you go through a couple of stages, which is basically nothing but rocket enemies. They destroy your shield in one hit and take off the rest of your health with another.
I think actually it does both. Like, it takes off your shield and then leaves you with a tiny sliver of health.
And some of the stages have little tasks that you have to complete. You got to sort of pick up an item and then deposit the item somewhere else. You've got switches that sometimes open doors, and you've got key cards. Fairly standard stuff. It's nothing really exceptional in that regard.
Okay, so for an early PlayStation game, or I should say for an early PlayStation FPS, this is a pretty good game. I mean, it's got issues, obviously. We noted the difficulty as you get further in and some other vagaries, I suppose you could say, but is there anything else you think that holds this game back that would keep you from playing it again?
You know, I'd say that it's a corridor FPS, and corridor FPSs are, well, they're really dated. You know, it's you versus the entire game. Essentially, for the whole game, you just walk through corridors, you look at enemies, the game locks onto them, and you shoot them. Occasionally, you screw up, and then you basically get instantly killed. There's some slightly more open areas here and there. Anything else? I guess the weapons hold it back a little bit, because there's nothing in the weapon set that you haven't really seen before. There's nothing really interesting or imaginative about, and the lock-on system sort of undermines the any sort of entertainment that you could get out of using different weapons, because essentially when you can lock on to enemies, you're just throwing numbers at them. Either you miss or you hit, and the game dictates that on whether you're locked on or not. And you got two extra weapons. You've got three, sorry. You've got the rocket launcher, the grenade launcher, and the charge laser. Now the rocket launcher is slow but kills enemies fairly effectively, but you only get a few rockets. I think you can max out your inventory at 8. But they're kind of risky to use, and because the hit detection of the game's kind of mangy, if you fire it too close to a wall, there is a 50-50 chance you'll just blow your own face off. And considering the rockets deal more damage to you than enemies, this is an unsafe weapon to use. And the grenade launcher, you don't lock on the grenade launcher. It's an exception to the game's weapons. That one just sort of fires at its own arc. But you sort of have to charge up the shot to make it arc anywhere, and it doesn't shoot very far, so you can't really use it. If you do use it, you're probably just going to kill yourself because you're going to be too close to the enemy, and you're going to die again because of how much damage it does to you. The last weapon is the charge laser. The big problem with the charge laser is you get it after the double laser, and the double laser kills enemies in a second. You just hold the button down, they're dead. Charge laser, you have to charge it up and then release it. And it doesn't do more damage because they're already dead in the charge time with the double laser. And because it's a projectile rather than a beam, it can miss. So, what can you say about that? The weapon set's not interesting.
It seems badly designed for the sort of game it is. Like, I wonder if it was supposed to be more open, because like a rocket launcher in a game where like 90% of it's really cramped rooms and hallways, like that's just a recipe for disaster. Like, you'd expect there to be a shotgun or something instead, or a flamethrower, or just some other close-range weapon, rather than this big explodey thing that'll murder your crap, pretty much.
That's a really good point. There is no short-ranged weapon in Tenka. You spend most of the game in spitting distance of your enemies. It's kind of dumb.
So essentially everything holds this game back in a way.
The only thing that doesn't hold this game back is music. I guess it's sort of, what do you describe it as, like industrial techno?
Yeah, like industrial electronica, that kind of sort of thing. Like, it was definitely, you can definitely tell it was from the latter half of the 90s, because it's got that sort of industrial feel to it. Like, maybe, I can't remember, like, if what it reminds me of. I wouldn't quite say it's full on like something like Prodigy or something, but it's definitely pretty heavy stuff. So
I liked it. It's great, and they do have a lot of music. There's about 12 songs in the game, and it has, I believe the total game is 26 levels. So 12 songs to 26 levels. You're actually not going to really get tired of the music because you're only going to hear the same song at most maybe 3 times, like in terms of through the different level sets. So that's really pleasant. And the sound effects actually are overall pretty strong. Everything.
Yeah, the sound design is really good. Like for the weapons, they feel meaty. Like you feel like you're like shooting guys with the big guns, so that helps.
Yeah, I mean the weapons. I actually really like the machine gun, and you got 3 different sounds for it. You know, you've got single shot,
double shot.
Double
You had
shot.
single,
Double
double, and then you have full-on auto.
Yeah, and they sound pretty good. Like they're nice, meaty sounds. The gun bounces. It actually ejects itself backwards slightly when you fire. It's got a ammo counter on the gun.
It's a magazine, I think, or clip or whatever. It like tells you how much ammo you have in reserve rather than what's your gun is currently loaded with.
But your gun's got the numbers and it, right?
Yeah, it's got
like
it's got a readout on it, which is actually pretty advanced for the time. That's
I
like
mean,
something that you wouldn't see until much later.
It's pretty nice. The gun. I mean, you only have one gun technically in the game, but they put a lot of work into it. They were like, well, we got one gun. It's gonna look good, and it does. It works quite well. I believe that do the lighting effects play on the gun? I think they do.
Yes, actually, the dynamic lighting, or it's semi-dynamic in that it actually casts on your gun, so it actually goes darker or lighter depending. It's actually a really impressive looking game for the PlayStation, especially in 1997.
Yeah, I'd say that's true. It's it's not gonna blow you away today, but
unless you really love colored lighting, in that case you'll have more than enough of your fill of that.
If you love colored lighting and corridors, oh my god, you're gonna have a field day. But yeah, it's kind of like there's lots of touches in the game that were nice, but the older it gets, sort of the worse it gets.
Yeah. It's definitely a game you either would have to have an extreme fondness for to really want to go back, or if you're just really curious about what early generation like 3D FPS game or console FPS games are like, or even PC FPS games, because the 3D, like I think 3D didn't really take off in FPS games until Quake. I mean, there were attempts before it, obviously, but after that point, like everything, just about every FPS game had to be 3D, or it was pretty much left in the dust. Which is kind of a shame, but...
That's something that I was thinking about, because Quake came out, and that was 96. That was, I think, late 96, wasn't it?
Yeah, mid to late. I can't remember exactly when it came out.
Yeah, mid to late 96. And then for the year that followed, 97, I argue that you saw a lot of games come out that weren't quite 3D yet, because, we're both big fans of Monolith's FPS Blood.
Yes.
Blood came out in 1997 in May. Tenka was still kind of pushing the limits early on, because you still had, throughout 97, you still had a bunch of games come out that weren't as technically impressive, at least pretty nice. Quake 2 would come out a little later, and that was,
Yeah, that was late, I think, really late, 1997. It was towards the tail end of it, from what I remember.
So, Snarboo, we've sort of touched on this, but how do you feel about Tenka compared to games that came out alongside Tenka? Would you have been happy with this game?
More than likely, yes. Either because my tastes were just different at the time, or because they weren't. Well, obviously, if you're comparing it to other games at the time, let's say it's 1997. What are your other options for PlayStation FPS games? I meant you have Disruptor, which is kind of similar in a lot of ways. You have, I think you also have Power Slave. I can't remember if you had the port of Duke Nukem yet. Duke Nukem 3D. There was a couple other ones that I'm drawing a blank on, but yeah, given how impressive it is, like it's basically like it's the closest thing I think the PlayStation 2 or the PlayStation, excuse me, got to the to Quake 2 until the Quake 2 port hit, and it still looks pretty impressive. Like I'm still impressed by what this game was able to do at the time. Like the game, it's dated, but it's still pretty playable. Like the things that kind of doom it are really most of its difficulty issues, so I'd say it compares pretty well to its contemporaries. It might even be the best that there was at the time. If we're talking PC games, it has a lot to live up to, really, because obviously you have Quake, you have Blood, you have Duke Nukem 3D, you have Doom released like 4 years before that. You have a bunch of other games that came out around that time. I can't remember if Shogo was 1997. I think it might have been. You also had Chasm the Rift, which You brought up earlier the whole dismemberment thing. I have no idea if Tenka was the first FPS game to have dismemberment that was released, but Chasm the Rift came out shortly thereafter in 1997, but there was a demo that also featured the full dismemberment system from the full game. Like you could shoot off an enemy's arms to disable them or just shoot off their head to kill them instantly. And it was something really more featured with the lightweight enemies, because as you got further in and fought some of the tougher enemies, they were much harder to like delimb, either because their hitboxes were weird or because you needed a stronger weapon. I think there was like a weapon threshold on some enemies, like, oh, you need the rocket launcher in order to shoot off this guy's arm or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it does. I'd say Kal Snarboo does technically win out by being, you know, not first to market, but first to demo. I don't believe there was a Tenka demo available.
No, I don't think there
beforehand.
was.
Tenka did get a demo. It was available. This is kind of neat. It was actually included on one of the editions of Demo 1, which is a kind of confusingly termed name for the demo that came with the PlayStation 1. There's like 17 or 18 different iterations of this demo. And Tenka was on one of them. And there was a lot of illustrious games that found their ways onto this demo. I mean, you know, they had Battle Arena Toshiden, Die Hard Arcade Trilogy.
You know, it's kind of a shame demo discs aren't a thing anymore, thinking about this. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I mean, yeah, demo discs. That's why I bought PlayStation magazines. I have a stack of PlayStation magazines because every magazine came with the demo disc, and so it was very helpful to try before you buy. That was nice. You didn't have to pirate games necessarily.
Yeah, you really didn't,
Today.
and like there was like rental was slightly better than it is now. Like so you could rent the game for a weekend. Like, well, I like this enough that I'd buy it, or you know, well, I can't beat this in a single weekend, so I definitely have to buy it. Or it's just like, yeah, this isn't good enough. It's fun for a rental.
In regards to Tenka, I think, yeah, if you owned a PC that was capable of playing Quake, you would have laughed at Tenka. I think that's basically what would have happened. The environments are smaller, the enemy set is smaller, the game doesn't have a difficulty setting, so it's, you know, you play through the first 4 or 5 levels and you'll hit a sort of a brick wall and just hate it. It's punishing. Even though you can continue an unlimited number of times, you screw up, you lose 20 minutes. Because there's no
20 or 30,
checkpoints.
yeah, depending on the complexity of the stage. Because after a certain point, like they loop-de-loop, and like there's all these keys you have to get. It's ridiculous.
That's, you know, I guess they're trying to add to the challenge, or they're just being typical Psygonsis bullshit.
They probably were doing that to save on memory, if I had to guess, actually, for level design. Because if you have a bunch of locked doors and then like you open up new corridors, it's almost like you've made the level bigger in a way. Like that's a common trick, I think, in some instances, is like you go down like this narrow path initially, and then more areas unlock or areas shift around, and it's reusing areas that you haven't actually, or that you visited before without realizing it. Which is, yeah, pretty clever.
Yeah, it's, you know, it's okay if you had a PlayStation 1, and because, you know, I didn't have a major gaming PC back in 96, 97. You know, you would have been really happy with Tenka, I think. If you needed to get a 3D FPS, you would be like, yes, this is the game. This is a great game. You get to shoot things in 3D. You get to move in 3D. It sounds great. It looked really good at the time. FPS-wise, what does it run at? 25, 30 FPS, I think?
Yeah, it's about 30. It's about 30, I think. Yeah, it's pretty stable 30. I forget, when did Medal of Honor come out? That was 98 or 99, wasn't it?
Yeah, the thing about the PlayStation, it was basically dead for first-person shooters. You had, like, as I mentioned earlier, you had a couple. There's an Alien Trilogy, and I think Alien Resurrection.
Oh yeah, Trilogy came out like in 96. That one was, well, yeah, Tenka's definitely better.
But yeah, like Medal of Honor and Quake 2, they both sort of came out similar time, like 99, 2000, I think. So Tenka had a good couple of years where it was kind of the best. I don't know. It's very close.
Now, if we're talking the N64, I'm trying to remember, was the only FPS game for that at the time Turok? Was there anything else, like before GoldenEye, besides Turok?
There was a Quake 1 port, wasn't there?
Yes, that's right, there was, and I think there was Doom 64, which that might have been 97, 96 as well. If we're going off of that, too, like Tenka, yeah, it probably sits pretty well against Turok and Doom 64, I'd say.
Quake 1 was released 1997 on the N64. I'm not quite sure if that was before or after Tenka, but you know, we close enough. And Doom 64, that was 97 or 98.
I thought it was 96. It could have been 97 though. It was definitely pretty early in the N64. Ah, so the same time then.
Yeah, so basically Tenka came out alongside Doom 64 and Quake 64. Doom 64 and Quake 64 are probably better games in terms of they've got longevity to them, they've got more enemies, more weapons, it's more fun to be had in them. But it's technically impressive on the PlayStation 1, and if you had a PlayStation 1 and it's 1997 and you need a first-person shooter, Tenka was a good bet. By 1999, it was no longer a good bet because you had Medal of Honor and Quake 2, and they're both way better. Just because they're not as punishing.
There's actually, there was a late life FPS too, and I know this doesn't really count, I just want to bring it up just because I'm a total geek. There was an FPS game based on the MIB cartoon, or Men in Black, and that came out really late, and it was late enough that it actually had DualShock support, and it plays pretty much like a modern twin-stick FPS, so that might be worth investigating if you like console FPS games, especially earlier ones.
If you're interested in games that no one's heard of, late PlayStation 1 games. Nobody's heard of them. There's just so much hype for the PlayStation 2, everyone just stopped paying attention.
Yeah, it's like anything that wasn't the PlayStation 2 is pretty much DOA.
Yeah, like the entire Dreamcast.
Yeah. Still bitter about that one, I will be honest.
Is it worth going back to Tenka?
Since we said the game is actually relatively dated, yeah, actually, I will say this. If you're just really curious about the history of FPS games in general, and especially console releases, because Tenka actually did have a PC port, so I guess if you're also just into weird, obscure PC FPS games, because it does have a port, yeah, it's probably definitely worth it if you just absolutely need to play every single game in this genre. Otherwise, you're probably better off just playing GoldenEye, Medal of Honor, Turok 2, Turok 3. There's no shortage of 32-bit gen FPS games that are better than this, so...
I think it's interesting, you mentioned several N64 first-person shooters, and the PlayStation was sort of the hardcore console. But I'd say that, yeah, the N64 has a better shooter library.
Which is kind of unusual to me, given the controller. Well, actually, you know what? It was probably the analog stick. That might have been part of it.
I don't think Tenka supports the analog stick. I think it was just too early, so you have to play with
1997, the DualShock was, what, 99, 2000?
I think the dual analog was earlier, but I think it was 98 or 99.
Yeah.
Tenka is a really interesting game. They came up with a lot of solutions to problems that they had, which actually you would see in later games. Because I don't know if it's the first game on a console like this to use it, but the lock-on system is a more transparent version of auto-aim. They basically tried to integrate the fast-paced action elements of a first-person shooter on a PC, but that's more of a technical interest.
Yes.
If you just want to see the game, you've already seen the video we've been playing of the game, and that's probably all you need. It doesn't do anything exceptional or special. I had a bit of fun. I was completely shocked that I enjoyed this game at all, because I was certain I was going to play it and it was just going to be just 1997 garbage first-person shooter console FPS.
It is definitely a fun little game because of the way the lock-on system works, and you don't have to worry too much about weapon switching. You can kind of just turn your mind off and just blow through a couple levels, take a break, come back to it.
Yeah, and there's no plot to it. You can just jump around. Use a cheat to skip all the levels and play the end level. Whatever, it's fine. I want to ask, if you were to give it a score, this completely arbitrary score, if you were to give it a score when it came out, if you had to review it for a magazine, and a score today, if you were to compare it, not just graphic-wise, but I mean just in terms of how it played, would you score it today?
Okay, if I had to score it back then, probably an 8 out of 10, because there wasn't a lot of competition. It's not a perfect game. I mean, some of the flaws that we notice now were probably evident at the time, but you could overlook it, given just how technically sound it was. If I had to rate it today, I would probably give it a 5 or a 6, because of how dated it is in a lot of respects, and just the weird difficulty curve. It's a thoroughly average game these days. You can get literally your fill of this sort of thing anywhere, everywhere, anytime.
I would give it... Contemporary, I was struggling because I wasn't really sure. At first, I thought I was going to give it an 8 because I thought it was really, it was good. But sort of the more problems I ran into in terms of the difficulty, I would give it a 7. It's such a rough game to get through. There are just definitely points in it where there's not really enjoyment to be had. And that sort of extends to what I'd give it today, compared to other games. I think I'd hit it with a 4 out of 10. I couldn't Couldn't go much higher than that just because I know that the difficulty is such a humongous turnoff for the game. And yeah, the missions are kind of confusing. So even though the levels, you know, are obviously dated, but they'd almost be better if all you had to do was get through the level and reach the end. You get confused sometimes and you're just like, what's my objective? It drags the levels on even when you're trying to finish them. And if you lose after 30 minutes and you have to go through a whole level again, there's no way you get
Well, there's something else too. Even after you complete your good lord, your objective, you actually still have to make it to the exit. Like there's an evac like door that opens up. It's very descent like, and you actually have to go through the facility. And half the time, they'll respawn like a bunch of enemies. And if it's a level with rocket launcher enemies, it can really suck to basically beat the level and then die like inches away from the exit.
They'll actually spawn enemies in the exit. There can be a guy waiting in the exit door with a rocket launcher pointed right at you. And that guy, I died to that guy once. I finished the whole level, I opened that door, and before I could respond, rocket in the face.
You mentioned the confusing levels, though. There's actually something I realized. There are actually little beacons you can drop.
Oh yeah, we didn't mention the beacons.
They'll actually show up on your radar. I actually had to use that in one of the levels because like, where the hell am I supposed to go after I beat it? And then it's like, I had to restart the stage because I died. I think I had beaten it and I just had died. And so I was like, yeah, next time I'll note where I see the evac door and just drop one of these things there. Sure enough, it actually really helped.
It's really interesting. I forgot to mention the beacons. They sort of try and make up for the fact that you don't have a map, so you can at least have some sort of semblance of where you've been. And then you can drop a lot of beacons. I think you can drop like 6 or 8, because each one you drop is a different color.
Wow, really? It's a different color? I only dropped like 1 or 2, and I thought they were both red. I didn't actually pay enough attention, so...
No, I think they drop... I think you can get different colored ones.
Oh, nice.
It's one of those little details this game has, which is completely pointless. It means nothing. But it's kind of neat. I mean, that's what it's kind of neat. Like, if you want it, it's okay. I don't know, I would have been happy with this game if I got it in 97.
Yeah, I definitely agree there. This would have been mind-blowing probably in 97 on the PlayStation, because you're like, man, look, colored lighting, like, you know, like these... Well, yeah, I'm not sure. I keep thinking colored lighting, because that was the big thing I remember. And Tenka definitely has that in spades, is the colored lighting, even if it might be faked. I mean, it's fully 3D, so there's that. Like, there's all these, like, different tile sets and enemy sets, even if they're relatively limited inside the stage itself. That is something it does, actually. It does try to keep it fresh every so many levels. And I actually can definitely applaud it for that.
Yeah, I mean, there's some stuff. It tried to look like an FPS from the late 90s, and it succeeded. So, in the middle of the recording, we stopped, and I actually went back, and I finished Tenka. I only had a couple of stages left, turns out, so I got all the way to the end. And Tenka has a couple of cutscenes in it. It has an opening cutscene, a midpoint cutscene, and an ending cutscene. The story doesn't really matter, so they only do like a short little cutscene. And yeah, I'm going to play the ending cutscene for you now, and you guys can check it out. I'm not going to tell you what happens in it, but I think you'll understand that if you saw this ending after you played this game for 10, 15 hours, and this was your reward, you'd probably snap the disc in half.